If you climb onto that horse, you won't make it 5 miles. Ethan Mercer's voice crossed the dry creek bed just as the Apache woman reached for her saddle. She stopped, but she did not turn. Evening had settled red over the Arizona territory, laying long shadows beneath the cottonwoods while dust drifted through the last strips of sunlight. Ethan had noticed her 10 minutes earlier beside the shallow water, filling a small leather flask, as though she were simply another traveler trying to outrun nightfall. Then he noticed the drops behind her, dark spots disappearing into pale dust, one every few feet. She wore a weathered buckskin coat despite the heat, and one hand remained pressed against her left side. "I said I'm fine," she answered. Her English was careful and quiet. Ethan looked at the ground instead of arguing. Another drop landed beside her boot. "Dust says different." Now she turned. Her name, though Ethan did not know it yet, was Nalin. She was perhaps 27, with dark hair tied back for travel and the stillness of someone accustomed to watching strangers before trusting them. Her horse stood behind her, tired but calm. Ethan kept both hands where she could see them. He had spent enough years on open range to recognize fear when it wore the mask of anger. "Go your way, cowboy." Was planning to. His eyes dropped toward the hand against her side. "Until I saw that." Nalin pulled her coat tighter. "Not yours to worry about." A warm breeze moved through the cottonwoods. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a hawk called once and went silent. Ethan smelled horse leather, dry sage, and something faintly metallic beneath both. He had smelled it before around injured cattle and ranch hands who insisted they could finish the day. "How long?" he asked. "Long enough." "That's not an answer. It is the one you have." She stepped toward her horse. Her balance shifted for half a second. Most men would have missed it. Ethan did not. He had spent 15 years judging whether a 1,000-pound steer was about to fall by nothing more than the change in its knees. Nalin caught the saddle horn and steadied herself. Ethan moved one step closer. Her hand immediately went toward the small knife at her belt. He stopped. The distance between them could not have been more than 12 feet, yet it carried every reason two strangers like them had learned not to trust each other. Ethan looked at her face. The color was leaving it. "Let me see it." Nalin's eyes hardened. "No. Whatever you're hiding under that coat is taking more out of you every minute." "Then let it." Ethan said nothing. That answer had not sounded brave. It had sounded decided. He slowly removed his hat and set it on a sun-bleached rock, then unhooked his canteen and placed it beside the hat. After that he stepped backward. "Water's yours if you want it." Suspicion crossed her face. "And the price?" "There isn't one." For the first time, Nalin seemed uncertain what to do with him. Ethan turned slightly away, giving her room instead of taking it. Behind him came the soft creak of leather as she reached for the saddle. One boot found the stirrup. Then everything went quiet. Ethan heard a sharp breath, the scrape of a heel through gravel, and the saddle leather snapping back empty. He turned. Nalin was on one knee beside the horse, one hand buried in the dust, the other still pressed desperately against her side. A strip of dark blue cloth had slipped beneath the edge of her coat. White thread crossed it in careful stitches. And beneath that cloth, the stain had spread farther than Ethan had feared. Nalin looked up at him, breathing shallowly. "Don't touch me." Ethan remained exactly where he was. But now he understood one thing with terrible certainty. She wasn't hiding a wound because it hurt. She was hiding it because, for reasons he could not yet understand, she feared his help more than whatever was slowly taking her strength. Nalin stayed on one knee, breathing through whatever pain she refused to name. Ethan did not move toward her. Instead, he crouched beside his canteen 12 feet away and pushed it across the dust until it stopped halfway between them. "You can take it yourself," he said. She watched him before reaching for the water. Even that small movement cost her. Her fingers closed around the canteen, and she drank only once before setting it down. "There is an old line shack about 2 miles west," Ethan said. "Roof leaks, door barely closes, but it is better than sleeping beside a creek. I am not going with you." "Did not ask you to." Nalin studied him, searching for the trick hidden inside the words. Ethan picked up his hat and walked toward his horse. "I am going there. You can follow or stay." He mounted and started west without looking back. For nearly a minute, there was only the creak of his saddle and the whisper of wind through dry grass. Then another set of hoofbeats came slowly behind him. Ethan allowed himself no smile. The sun had nearly disappeared when they reached the shack, a small timber structure left years ago by cattlemen who had moved their grazing farther north. Ethan dismounted first. He entered alone, checked the corners, opened the single window, and lit an old lantern hanging from a nail. Then he stepped outside. Empty. Nalin slid carefully from her horse. Her boots touched the ground, but her knees nearly failed again. Ethan instinctively reached forward, then stopped before crossing the distance between them. She noticed. Something in her expression changed, though only for a moment. Inside, Ethan placed a folded blanket near the wall and set his supplies on the wooden table. Clean cloth, a tin cup, soap, and a small sewing kit used mostly for torn shirts and saddle straps. Nalin remained beside the doorway. "Those are for you," he said. "I will wait outside." "Why?" Ethan glanced at her. "Because you told me not to touch you." That answer seemed to trouble her more than an argument would have. He walked outside and sat beneath the cottonwood beside the shack. Darkness settled quickly over the desert. Stars appeared above the ridge, sharp and cold. Ethan listened to the horses shifting near the hitching rail. From inside came the faint sound of water pouring into the tin cup, then silence. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Ethan kept his eyes on the horizon. Somewhere far off, a coyote called. Suddenly the tin cup struck the floor inside. Ethan stood but did not enter. Nalin. No answer. He froze. She had never told him her name. Yet he had heard it earlier, barely more than a whisper, when she had spoken to her horse at the creek. "I am coming to the door," he said. He stepped into the doorway and stopped. Nalin sat against the wall, pale beneath the lantern light. The clean cloth remained untouched beside her. Her hands were trembling too badly to use it. She looked toward Ethan, anger and exhaustion fighting behind her eyes. Then, slowly, she pointed toward the table. "The cloth," she said. Ethan brought it closer and placed it within reach. That was when he noticed something on the old blue wrapping she had loosened from beneath her coat. Caught between the folds was a tiny dark fragment, no larger than a shirt button. Ethan leaned closer without touching it. He had seen metal like that before. Not in an arrowhead. Not in a hunting knife. It was manufactured iron, broken from something made in a frontier workshop. Nalin saw recognition enter his face. Her hand closed over the cloth. "You know what it is." Ethan lifted his eyes to hers. "I know what it is not." Outside, one of the horses suddenly raised its head toward the eastern trail. A moment later, faint hoofbeats carried through the darkness. More than one rider, and they were coming closer. The hoofbeats did not hurry. That made Ethan trust them even less. Men who feared being late rode hard. Men who believed their quarry had nowhere left to go took their time. He crossed to the lantern and lowered the flame until the shack fell into amber shadow. Nalin tried to stand. Her legs refused the order. "Stay down," Ethan said. Her eyes sharpened. "Do not command me. Then consider it advice." He moved to the window and listened. 3 horses, perhaps 4, still more than half a mile away. Nalin gathered the blue cloth into her hand and pushed herself upright against the wall. Ethan looked toward the dark fragment hidden in its folds. "Whatever that came from, those riders know about it." She said nothing. "Are they following you?" Silence again. Ethan turned from the window. "I cannot help with a story you refuse to tell." "I did not ask for help." "No. You only followed me 2 miles while leaving blood in the dust." Nalin looked away. The hoofbeats grew clearer. Ethan could feel the rhythm through the floorboards now. He crossed to the table and poured clean water into the cup. "If you want to leave before they arrive, you need enough strength to sit a saddle." Nalin's jaw tightened. "And if I cannot, then we make them believe nobody is here." He expected another refusal. Instead, she slowly uncovered the blue cloth. Ethan saw only what he needed to see. An old wrapping darkened from travel, a wound beneath it swollen enough to explain the fever in her eyes, and the small iron fragment lodged near its edge. He had treated ranch injuries before, but he knew the limits of rough frontier medicine. "That piece needs to come out," he said. "I know. How long has it been there?" 2 days. Ethan looked at her. "You rode 2 days like this?" "I had somewhere to be." Outside, the horses were perhaps a quarter-mile away. Ethan washed his hands, cleaned a pair of small tweezers from his kit, and placed them beside her. "You decide," he said. Nalin stared at the tools. Her hands shook again when she reached for them. She stopped. Pride held for another second. Then necessity won. "Do it." Ethan knelt beside her, careful and deliberate. If you tell me to stop, I stop. She nodded once. He worked quickly, using the lantern only long enough to see clearly. Nalin fixed her eyes on the opposite wall and breathed slowly. Within moments, the fragment came free. Ethan dropped it into the tin cup. It made a tiny sound. Almost nothing. Yet both of them stared at it. Ethan lifted the cup toward the lantern. One edge was curved. Another carried a narrow groove pressed by machinery. He had seen that pattern on iron traps sold through trading posts from Tucson north toward Prescott. Expensive ones. New ones. This did not come from a weapon, Ethan murmured. Nalin replaced the cloth carefully. No, it came from a trap. Her eyes met his. Before she could answer, the riders stopped outside. No one called out. No one approached the door. The silence stretched until Ethan heard leather creak beneath someone's weight. Then a man's voice came from the darkness. Mercer, we know you are in there. Ethan recognized it. Silas Roark, foreman for the largest cattle outfit east of the ridge. A man who never rode this far after sunset without a reason. We are looking for an Apache woman, Silas continued. She took something that does not belong to her. Ethan glanced at Nalin. She was no longer watching the door. She was watching the iron fragment in the cup. And for the first time since he had found her beside the creek, Ethan saw something stronger than fear in her face. Recognition. They are lying, she whispered. Ethan kept his voice low. About what? Nalin reached into the lining of her coat and pulled out a small folded paper, stained with dust and worn soft from 2 days of writing. About what I took, she said, and about who it belongs to. The paper looked too ordinary to have brought 4 riders through the desert after dark. Ethan held out his hand, but Nalin did not give it to him. She unfolded it herself and turned it toward the lantern. Lines had been drawn across the page in black ink, marking Cottonwood Creek, the eastern ridge, and 3 parcels Ethan knew belonged to small ranch families. A 4th line cut directly through Apache grazing ground beyond the hills. In the lower corner sat the seal of the Territorial Land Office. Ethan leaned closer. Where did you get this? Where they did not want me looking. Outside, Silas Roark called again. Mercer, this is not your concern. Ethan lowered the lantern until the room dimmed. Funny thing about men saying that. Usually means they are worried it might become my concern. Nalin almost smiled. Almost. Ethan noticed the change before she folded the paper again. There is another way out, he whispered. Back window, 20 yards to the wash. Follow it west. Nalin shook her head. I would not make 20 yards. She was right. Fever had put a shine in her eyes, and even sitting upright required effort. Ethan looked toward the door, then at the iron fragment resting inside the tin cup. Silas, he called. What exactly did she steal? A pause followed. Company papers. Which company? Another pause. Longer this time. Open the door. Ethan's expression hardened. That was not my question. One of the horses shifted outside. Silas spoke more carefully now. She wandered onto private range and took documents from a survey camp. We only want them returned. Nalin leaned toward Ethan. The camp was not on private range. How do you know? Because my people have used that spring since before his company existed. Her voice remained quiet, but something underneath it had changed. Ethan had heard that tone in old ranchers defending graves, wells, and boundary stones. It was not anger. It was memory refusing to move. He glanced at the map again. What were they surveying? Nalin hesitated. Then she answered. Land they intend to claim after moving everyone already living on it. Ethan understood. The little ranches marked on the page were not random. The Harlan widow owned one. The Ortega family owned another. The third belonged to 2 brothers who had spent 15 years digging irrigation channels by hand. None were rich enough to fight a cattle company in court. Nalin's people had even less reason to expect the territorial office to listen. Outside, Silas tried a different approach. Mercer, she is sick. Hand her over, and we will take her somewhere she can be treated. Nalin's eyes closed briefly. Ethan watched her reaction. You believe him? He whispered. Do you? No. That earned the faintest breath of laughter from her. Ethan took the clean cloth from the table. Your wrapping needs changing. She stiffened automatically. I can manage. Her hands betrayed her before the words finished. Ethan waited. He did not reach toward her. After several seconds, Nalin loosened the old blue cloth herself and held out the fresh one. Permission. Nothing more. Ethan worked carefully, keeping his attention on the task. When he finished, he picked up the old blue strip. White thread crossed one corner in 3 small diamond shapes. His hand stopped. He had seen that pattern before. Not in a trading post. Not on a saddle blanket. In a cedar box his mother had kept beneath her bed for 20 years. Ethan stared at the stitching. Where did you get this? Nalin looked at him strangely. My grandmother made it. The room seemed suddenly smaller. Ethan swallowed. What was her name? Nalin answered softly. Sonny. Ethan went still. Outside, Silas called his name again, but Ethan barely heard him. His mother had spoken that name only once, years ago, while holding a piece of blue cloth stitched with 3 white diamonds. The name of the Apache woman who had saved her life. Ethan had been 9 years old when he first heard Sonny's name. His mother had spoken it beside a winter fire, her hands wrapped around a cup she had forgotten to drink from. She told him about a storm in the mountains, a frightened young woman lost miles from any settlement, and an Apache healer who found her before the cold did. Sonny had shared food, medicine, and a blanket, then guided her home when the weather cleared. Ethan remembered asking why he had never met the woman who saved her. His mother had looked into the flames and answered with words he understood only now. Some debts are too important to repay with money. Nalin washed his face beneath the weak lantern light. Your mother knew my grandmother? Her name was Margaret Mercer. Nalin's expression changed immediately. Margaret. She spoke the name as if retrieving it from somewhere far away. My grandmother told that story. Ethan looked at her. She did. She called her the woman who laughed during a snowstorm. Despite everything outside the shack, Ethan smiled. That sounds like my mother. For a moment, the riders disappeared from their thoughts. There was only the lantern, the smell of sage drifting through the open window, and a strip of blue cloth connecting 2 families that had never expected to meet again. Nalin touched the white stitching with one finger. My grandmother said Margaret tried to give her a silver necklace. My mother said Sonny refused it. She did. Why? Nalin's eyes lifted to his. Because kindness becomes smaller when you put a price on it. Ethan let the words settle. Outside, Silas called again, but his voice carried less confidence now. Ethan crossed to the window and saw 4 dark shapes against the starlight. Nobody had approached the porch. They were waiting for fear to do their work. You should leave, Nalin said. Ethan turned. This is my shack tonight. They want me. They want that map. That is why you should leave. Ethan walked back to the table. My mother lived because your grandmother decided a stranger mattered. Nalin shook her head. You owe me nothing for something done before we met. Good. He placed the blue cloth beside her. Because debt is not why I am staying. She studied him carefully. Then why? Ethan looked toward the door. Because 4 men followed a sick woman across open country for a piece of paper, and not one of them has asked whether she needs a doctor. Silence filled the shack. Nalin lowered her eyes. For the first time, the guarded strength in her face softened. There is something I have not told you. Ethan waited. The map is not the only paper. From inside her coat, she removed a second folded sheet, smaller than the first. It carried names, dates, parcel numbers, and payments besides several signatures. Ethan recognized 2 names immediately. One belonged to Silas Roark. The other belonged to Deputy Land Clerk Warren Pike in Prescott. What is this? A record of money paid to change boundary surveys. Ethan read the figures twice. Suddenly, the altered property lines made sense. Small ranchers would lose water first. Apache families would lose access to the spring. Then the cattle company could claim the valley cheaply. Where did you find it? He asked. Nalin's voice dropped. In the survey camp. And the iron? Her fingers tightened around the blue cloth. I found the papers. They discovered me before I reached my horse. I ran through their equipment in the dark and caught my side on one of their traps. Ethan looked toward the tin cup. The fragment was no longer merely evidence of an injury. It connected Nalin to the camp and the camp to the men outside. Then Silas spoke from beyond the door. Last chance, Mercer. Ethan folded the payment record carefully and returned it to Nalin. No, he said quietly. I think it is yours. Silas Roark did not answer immediately. The desert answered for him. Wind moved through the cottonwood branches, carrying dust against the shack in soft, dry whispers. Ethan stood near the door while Nalin folded the payment record and returned it beneath her coat. Mercer, Silas finally called. You have known me 6 years. Long enough to know you never ride 4 men into the hills after midnight for missing paperwork. One rider muttered something Ethan could not hear. Silas silenced him. That woman trespassed on company property. She says it was Apache land. She says. Ethan glanced at Nalin. She was watching him closely. And the Harlan place? Ethan called. That Apache land too? Silence. Or the Ortega farm. Or the spring the Bell brothers have watered cattle from since 1868. Silas changed his tone. You do not understand what you are holding. Then explain it. Open the door. Ethan almost laughed. You first. Nalin touched the wall and slowly stood. The fresh wrapping had helped, but fever still pulled at her strength. There is a survey marker, she whispered. 3 miles north. They replaced the original stone with a new post. Ethan looked back. Can you prove it? The old marker is still there, buried beneath rocks 50 yards east. Ethan understood immediately. If the original boundary marker remained, the map could be compared against something physical. Paper could be denied. Ink could be called false. A stone placed years earlier was harder to argue with. He stepped toward the rear window. There is a dry wash behind this shack. It runs north. Nalin shook her head. I cannot ride. You will not have to. Ethan pointed toward his bay gelding outside the back wall. Buck can follow that wash without a rider leading him. Her eyes narrowed. And you? I am going out the front. For men are waiting there. Which means nobody is watching the back. Ethan removed his gun belt. Nalin stared at him. You are leaving that. If I walk outside wearing it, every frightened man gets an excuse to become foolish. He hung the belt from a wooden peg. Then he took the tin cup containing the iron fragment and wrapped it carefully in a clean cloth. Nalin watched him place it inside his coat. You trust them? She asked. No. Then why go without a gun? Ethan looked toward the door. Because I want witnesses tomorrow, not excuses tonight. Something shifted in Nalin's expression. She had expected courage to look like a weapon. Ethan was showing her another kind. He moved to the back window and pushed it open wider. Cool desert air entered the room. Follow the wash for 2 miles. There is a split cottonwood beside a limestone shelf. Wait there. You think I will leave you? I think you have papers that matter more than either of us. Nalin held his gaze. My people were supposed to meet me at the northern spring tomorrow morning. I was carrying these records to them. Ethan nodded. Then tomorrow morning just became important. Outside, Silas called again. Time is up. Ethan crossed to the door. Before he reached it, Nalin spoke. Ethan. It was the first time she had used his name. He turned. She held out the blue cloth. Take this. Why? Because if they search you, they will look for papers. They will not look twice at an old piece of cloth. Ethan accepted it. The white diamonds caught the lantern light. Nalin climbed carefully through the rear window and disappeared into the darkness. Ethan waited until he heard Buck's soft hoofbeats fading northward. Then he opened the front door. 4 riders faced him beneath the stars. Ethan stepped onto the porch with empty hands. Silas looked past him toward the dark shack. Where is she? Ethan closed the door behind him. You rode all this way to ask the wrong question. Silas stared at Ethan from the saddle, his face half hidden beneath the brim of his hat. The question is simple, Mercer. Simple questions usually have simple answers. Ethan stepped away from the door, keeping his hands visible. You want the woman. I want to know why a cattle company needs secret surveys, altered boundaries, and 4 riders hunting paperwork after midnight. The men behind Silas shifted uneasily. One was young enough that his beard had barely filled in. Another wore the brass star of a company range guard, not a lawman. Ethan noticed both details. Witnesses, whether Silas liked it or not. You have been listening to lies, Silas said. Then ride with me to the northern marker at sunrise. The words landed harder than any accusation. Silas went still. Ethan continued. We will invite the Harlan widow, the Ortega family, the Bell brothers, and Sheriff Cole from Red Mesa. We will compare the new survey post against the original stone. The youngest rider looked toward Silas. What original stone? Silas ignored him. There is no original marker. Ethan nodded slowly. Then you have nothing to worry about. Silence stretched across the yard. A horse stamped once. Somewhere in the darkness, night insects hummed beneath the cottonwoods. Silas finally dismounted. Search the shack. Ethan remained in front of the door. Not without the sheriff. This is company property. No. This line shack belongs to the Mercer lease until November. Ethan reached into his shirt pocket and removed the folded lease receipt he carried with his tobacco papers. Signed in Red Mesa last spring. Silas did not take it. He only stared at Ethan. That was enough. You always were stubborn, he said. My mother called it patience. The mention of Margaret Mercer meant nothing to Silas, but Ethan felt the blue cloth inside his coat like a quiet weight. Somewhere north, Nalin was carrying evidence toward the old marker. All Ethan had to do was give her time. Suppose we wait for sunrise, Silas said. Suppose we do. And suppose your Apache friend does not appear. Ethan's expression did not change. Then the stone still will. One of the riders looked away. Silas had begun losing something more valuable than control of the conversation. He was losing certainty in his own men. Ethan stepped down from the porch and walked toward the hitching rail. Red Mesa is 12 miles south. Your youngest rider can reach Sheriff Cole before dawn if he leaves now. The young man looked surprised. Me? Unless Mr. Roark objects to having the law present. Silas turned toward him. For a second, nobody spoke. Then Silas smiled without warmth. Go ahead, Thomas. Bring the sheriff. Thomas mounted and rode south. Ethan watched until the hoofbeats faded. One witness had become an independent messenger. That changed everything. You think you are clever, Silas said. No. Ethan looked toward the eastern horizon, where the black sky had begun fading to charcoal. I think daylight makes certain things harder to hide. They waited. No guns came out. No threats were needed. By the time the first pale line of morning appeared, Silas looked more tired than Ethan felt. Then a sound carried from the north. Not one horse. Many. Silas turned sharply. Ethan did the same. Riders appeared along the distant ridge, dark against the growing dawn. At their front rode Nalin on Buck, upright despite her fever. Beside her were several Apache elders and riders. But behind them came something Silas had not expected at all. 2 wagons from the Harlan and Ortega properties were following the same trail. Nalin had not merely reached her people. She had brought everyone whose land appeared on the map. Ethan looked at Silas. Now, he said quietly, we can ask the right question. By sunrise, the little line shack had become the busiest patch of ground for 20 miles. Nalin dismounted slowly, and Ethan saw the effort she hid from everyone else. An older Apache woman immediately moved beside her, but Nalin remained standing. Behind them came 6 Apache riders, Mrs. Harlan in her wagon, Mateo Ortega with his eldest son, and the Bell brothers on horseback. Thomas returned shortly afterward with Sheriff Amos Cole, a gray-haired lawman who looked annoyed at being pulled from bed until Ethan placed the altered map in his hands. Where did this come from? Cole asked. Nalin answered before anyone else could. A survey camp north of Cottonwood Creek. Silas stepped forward. Stolen company property. Sheriff Cole unfolded the second paper. His expression changed as he read the names and payments. And this? Silas said nothing. Ethan removed the wrapped tin cup from his coat and showed Cole the small iron fragment. That came from a trap at the same camp. There are more like it there. Silas gave a dry laugh. A piece of iron proves nothing. Correct, Ethan said. That is why we are going to the marker. They rode north together. Nobody spoke much. The morning air smelled of sage and damp earth where the creek bent toward the hills. Nalin rode beside Ethan, pale but steady. After nearly 3 miles, she pointed toward a fresh wooden post driven into rocky ground. Survey numbers had been carved along one side. Sheriff Cole compared them with the map. Then Nalin walked 50 yards east and stopped beside a low pile of stones. Mateo and the Bell brothers helped move them. Beneath the loose rock stood an older boundary marker, weathered by years of sun. Its numbers did not match the new post. Mrs. Harlan covered her mouth. Mateo simply stared. Sheriff Cole checked the papers again. According to this original marker, the new survey shifts the line nearly 2 miles west. Enough to take our spring, one Bell brother said. And my lower pasture, Mrs. Harlan added. An Apache elder spoke quietly through Nalin. The shifted boundary would also cut their families away from Cottonwood Creek. The silence afterward carried more weight than shouting could have. Silas looked around and realized there was nobody left to convince. Sheriff Cole folded the records and placed them inside his coat. Mr. Roark, you and I are riding to Red Mesa. The territorial judge can decide what these signatures mean. Silas looked toward Ethan, perhaps waiting for triumph. Ethan offered none. He only stepped aside. Justice did not need humiliation added to it. By late morning, Silas and his remaining men rode south with Sheriff Cole. The ranch family stayed behind, speaking quietly with the Apache elders over the old marker. Ethan found Nalin near the creek, washing dust from her hands. The older Apache woman had checked her bandage and given her something warm to drink. "You should rest," Ethan said. Nalin glanced at him. "You say that often. You ignore it often." This time she smiled. Ethan reached into his coat and removed the blue cloth. "This belongs to you." Nalin did not take it. "Keep it. Your grandmother made it. And your mother remembered it." She closed his fingers around the cloth. "Some things belong to the road between people." Ethan looked down at the 3 white diamonds. When he raised his eyes again, Nalin had loosened the edge of her coat just enough to inspect the clean wrapping at her side. The fever had eased. The bleeding had stopped. She noticed Ethan deliberately looking away. "Ethan." He turned back. Nalin rested one hand lightly over the bandage. There was no fear in her expression now. "You may look." Ethan did not move closer. He simply nodded once. And Nalin understood that the distance between them had finally become hers to close. 3 months later, the summer heat had softened into the first cool mornings of fall when Ethan saw a familiar horse standing beside Cottonwood Creek. He recognized the rider before she turned. Nalin stood near the water beneath the same cottonwoods where they had first met, but nothing about her seemed hurried now. Her face carried color again. Her movements were steady. The old buckskin coat had been replaced by a lighter traveling jacket, and when she reached down to fill her flask, there was no trail of dark drops following her through the dust. Ethan dismounted 20 feet away. "You always appear without warning?" Nalin looked over her shoulder. "You always talk this much?" He smiled. "Only around people who disappear for 3 months. I had somewhere to be." He remembered those same words from the shack. This time they carried no pain. Ethan led his horse toward the creek. Tied around the saddle horn was the blue cloth with 3 white diamonds. Nalin noticed it immediately. "You kept it. You told me to. You do everything you are told?" "Not according to Sheriff Cole." That brought a quiet laugh from her. The territorial investigation had moved slowly, as such things often did, but it had moved. Warren Pike had been removed from the land office while the altered surveys were reviewed. The original boundary markers had been recorded before witnesses, and the Harlan, Ortega, and Bell properties remained where they had always been. Cottonwood Creek remained open to the Apache families who had used its water long before any company map gave the valley another name. Silas Roark had left the territory before winter. No celebration followed. No parade. No grand speech. Just fences staying where they belonged and water continuing to run where it always had. Ethan thought that was enough. Nalin walked beside him toward the shade. "My grandmother asked about Margaret." Ethan stopped. "Sonny is alive?" Nalin nodded. 72 years old, and still telling everyone what to do. Ethan looked toward the mountains. For a moment, he imagined 2 old women separated by decades, each carrying the memory of a winter neither family had forgotten. "My mother would have liked that." "My grandmother said your mother still owes her a cup of coffee." Ethan laughed softly. "That sounds like a debt I can pay." Nalin sat on a flat stone beside the creek. She hesitated, then touched her left side through the jacket. "The healer says there will always be a scar." Ethan's smile faded. "Does it hurt?" "Only when the weather changes." A cool breeze moved across the water. Nalin looked at him for several seconds, then carefully lifted the edge of her jacket enough to show the small place where the wound had healed beneath her clothing. Nothing dramatic remained. Only a mark that time had begun turning pale. Ethan looked once, then met her eyes again. "Looks stubborn. Like someone I know." "Your grandmother?" "I was thinking of a cowboy." They sat in silence while their horses lowered their heads to drink. Ethan untied the blue cloth from his saddle and held it toward her. "I still think this should go home." Nalin closed his hand around it again. "It is home." Ethan looked at the white stitching, then at the creek moving between stones polished by years of water. On the opposite bank, Apache riders appeared along the trail. Farther south, Mateo Ortega and one of the Bell brothers repaired a fence near the old boundary. Nobody stopped working. Nobody reached for anything. They simply acknowledged one another across the water and continued with the morning. Nalin stood beside Ethan. Their shoulders did not touch, but neither stepped away. Months earlier, 12 feet of dust had felt like a border between 2 worlds. Now there was only a narrow creek, 2 horses drinking from the same water, and an old blue cloth moving gently in the wind. Ethan had once believed courage meant standing your ground. Nalin had taught him something quieter. Sometimes courage meant giving another person enough room to choose whether they would stand beside you. And beneath the Arizona sky, with no promise